CP, and welcome to Help I'm Teaching, a podcast for amateur educators. This podcast is intended for people who aren't professional teachers, but have put themselves in a situation where they need to teach something. For example, maybe you volunteered at a nonprofit or school program to teach 5th graders Newton's 3 laws of motion, and you'd like a quick refresher as well as a few fun facts, analogies, and avenues for further exploration so you can be a step above just showing a YouTube video. If you're an actual teacher, I hope you could also gain a new perspective on something you've taught dozens of times. It's my goal that by the time you finish listening, you won't just be confident in teaching a topic, you'll be excited. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell University in plant sciences with a minor in biomedical sciences, and I'm starting this podcast because pivoting from lab work into early science education takes a lot of adjusting. My experience and what my coworkers tell me is that when you start, you have to quickly review topics as you teach them, and a lot of resources I find go too deep, not deep enough, or just plain aren't interesting. This episode, I want to talk about cells. I'll do an overview, talk about some common statements used when discussing cells, anticipate and answer questions about cells, and even dive a bit into the philosophy of science. Most of this section comes from LibreText's microbiology textbook chapter 5.1 to 5.6, but I'll leave the transcript along with the other sources in the show notes. Cells are the building blocks of life. What does that mean? Basically, everything that's alive is either a cell or made of multiple cells. Cells come in all different forms, but most share a few characteristics that allow us to classify them. A plasma membrane that forms the outer layer, DNA for instructions to make proteins, ribosomes to actually make those proteins, and cytoplasm that acts as a media for all the components to be suspended in. You might have noticed that some things you'd expect are missing, like mitochondria and nuclei. These perform important roles in the cells that have them, and we'll discuss them later, but as was drilled into me in undergrad, biology is full of exceptions. Unicellular organisms like bacteria are a self-contained living thing in a single cell, and are called prokaryotes. Other living things like plants, animals, and us are made of many cells working together and are called eukaryotes. Before we knew life could exist on such a small scale, people believed in something called spontaneous generation, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that, given proper environmental conditions, life would be created. It sounds stupid to us, but I honestly think it's a great example of hypotheses based on observations. Maggots appearing in rotting meat from seemingly nowhere? Maggots are created by rotting meat. It makes me wonder what things we believe today that future generations will look back on and roll their eyes at. This was eventually replaced by what we call today cell theory, which was developed when a scientist named Louis Pasteur, yes, Pasteur of milk fame, discovered that nutrient broth left in an airtight chamber would not develop mold, but would when the seal was broken. This suggested that there were microscopic organisms living in the air. Cell theory is made up of 3 components. First, all life is made up of cells. Second, all cells come from other cells. Third, cells are the smallest unit of life. Now let's talk about some other important components of cells that aren't present in all of them. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. It's a joke at this point, but yes, cells need energy to perform functions of life. In mitochondria, aerobic respiration takes place, which is the use of oxygen to generate ATP, or the energy currency of the cell. If you listened to the last episode on photosynthesis, mitochondria evolved in a similar way as a free-living organism that would find mutual benefit in living inside a larger organism. Next, the nucleus. All cells pass their genetic information when they divide, and most store that genetic information in the nucleus, which is a dark rounded region inside the cell membrane bound by a special nuclear membrane. The vacuole is another important structure in the cell, and it's an empty space where things can be separated from the rest of the cell. Things like toxic wastes, dangerous enzymes, and foreign pathogens can all end up in vacuoles, and will usually be dealt with by excreting them, reacting with them to create less dangerous forms, or both. Some vacuoles also store water, which is useful in maintaining the structure of a plant. Your students may have heard the term cell wall. Not all cells have a cell wall. Only plants, fungi, and some bacteria have cell walls as well as cell membranes. Our cells, and those of animals in general, only have cell membranes. The difference is, the cell membrane is more flexible and can allow certain substances to pass through it, like food, while the cell wall is rigid, impermeable, and used for structural support. An egg is the largest example of a cell which can be seen with the naked eye. In fact, when you draw a cell with a nucleus, you should encourage the comparison to a sunny side-up egg. However, the size of any single cell is limited by what's known as the square-cube law. This states that the surface area of a cell dictates how much oxygen it can consume from the environment at a time, while the volume dictates how fast it can process that oxygen. Because volume increases much faster than surface area as something grows in 3 dimensions, eventually the cell won't be able to take in enough energy to support its own functions. Your students might wonder how they can be made of a collection of other living things. Living things can be identified loosely with the acronym Mrs. Gren, which contains 7 essential characteristics for life: movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion, and nutrition. Many cells, including ones in your body, exhibit these traits. Even the brain, which is the organ we could most call you, is made of millions of cells. But there's an individual you, right? I like to think of it like a sports team. When we say that the Los Angeles Clippers beat the Sacramento Kings, we have an understanding that the Clippers have players, coaches, and support staff that all play different roles and add up to a basketball team that can perform actions as a single entity. We're definitely not implying every member of the Clippers, coaches and support staff included, went one-on-one against every member of the Kings and won every round. Some people make long-term strategy decisions, some people play, and some people get the players and decision makers where they need to be. However, there is an entity we can call the Los Angeles Clippers. Confused? Me too. But your students can have a great time discussing this fundamental problem in biology and philosophy and considering the implications. Now, here's some questions that might be asked in no particular order. Where did the first cell come from? There's a Nobel Prize in it for you if you can answer that one correctly, but it's generally accepted that the first cells came from non-living material. In what's known today as the Miller-Urey experiment, 2 scientists created a flask setup that resembled our hypotheses on pre-life Earth, then added electrodes to simulate lightning. After running it continuously for 1 week, they discovered amino acids, the precursors to proteins, inside. We're still trying to replicate the exact conditions that not only create those precursors to organic molecules, but give rise to life. Again, Nobel Prize in it for you and your students. Do cells leave waste products like animals? Poop jokes are always a great hook, and in this case have ecological relevance. Waste can be something stored in a vacuole that separates it from the rest of a cell. Some cells excrete waste products left over from cellular processes into the surrounding environment. This happens with bacteria in the soil that consume one form of nitrogen and excrete it into a form that plants can use more freely. I said some cells don't have mitochondria. How can cells live without producing energy? There's an alternative form of creating ATP called anaerobic respiration that doesn't require mitochondria, but produces much less ATP. It's only used by organisms that live where there is no oxygen, or by us when we need a sudden burst of energy. It produces toxic waste products like lactic acid. When your muscles ache after a big sprint or a set of curls on dumbbells, that's the lactic acid doing its thing. How do cells pass genetic info without nuclei? Some cells, especially unicellular organisms like prokaryotes, instead have a nucleoid region, which, instead of being bound, has that genetic information floating in the cytoplasm. And some cells begin life with nuclei, but lose them during development, such as your red blood cells. On the flip side, some cells like certain types of muscle cells have multiple nuclei as it aids in uptake of nutrients and oxygen. Why is it called a nucleus? Does it have anything to do with nuclear energy? No, though, confusingly atoms also have their own nuclei. Nucleus is derived from the Latin word nucleus, which means kernel or core. It just so happens that in physics, a nucleus refers to the dense region in the center of an atom. A nucleus in biology and a nucleus in physics have no relation to each other. Likewise, when you see the word nuclear in the context of cell biology, it's likely referring to something correlated with the nucleus, like the nuclear membrane. How do cells sense the environment and each other? A lot of times, it's receptors. A receptor is a structure that sends a signal to the cell when it detects a certain type of molecule. How many types of receptors are there? So many that scientists refer to lock and key theory, where each protein has a specific receptor or receptors for it, and this specificity is very important. After all, you wouldn't want your cells to confuse sugars from the food you ate with the neurotransmitters in your brain. They react to signals from these receptors in different ways depending on what molecule they're looking for. For example, a food receptor being activated could prompt the cell to move closer in that direction for more food, or a signaling molecule receptor could tell a cell to stop or start dividing. An example of these kinds of receptors is your taste buds. Molecules from food activate different receptors on your tongue and send different sensations to your brain. Are viruses like COVID-19 made of cells? They are instructions to hijack a cell's machinery to create more of itself, but they're never an independent organism, which is why some biologists have trouble classifying them as alive. Even though there are times where a host is preferable, pathogens like bacteria and parasites can exist without them in the correct environment and time in their development, even if not for very long. In this context, it's helpful to think of a computer virus. Computer viruses use computers to spread, but they don't have their own physical body. There is no such thing as a computer virus that exists independently of something like a computer, flash drive, or otherwise, and crawls around on the ground looking for computers to infect. For now, at least. I said making proteins is important for cells. What does protein do? Most things cells do involve proteins, and 90% of the time, if you say something is done by a protein or a series of proteins, you'd be correct. Some examples are acting as enzymes to speed up reactions, as transporters to move important molecules, and in structural roles like in your nails. In nutrition, protein refers to any substance like these you get from your food, which are then broken down and reconstituted into the different proteins that you need. If glucose is so important to cells, why do people say sugar is bad for you? It's not necessarily that glucose is bad for a cell, but it's bad for an interconnected physiological system like the human body. Overexposure to glucose can cause the cells in your pancreas to become desensitized to the hormone insulin, causing high blood sugar. This is known as type 2 diabetes and has negative consequences like fatigue and blurred vision. Furthermore, too much glucose is also being demonstrated to have negative effects on the immune system. So we're unfortunately just too complex as organisms for it to be that simple. If your students like the idea of being made of lots of living cells, you could use that to introduce the idea of the human microbiome. The human microbiome is a concept that we have a diversity of microorganisms like fungi and bacteria that we carry with us at all times and are essential to our survival. It's a developing field, but scientists think some bacteria in our intestines aid digestion and affect our mood, while others on our skin aid our immune system. After the first lecture I had on this, I had to go home and take a long shower, but it's already an avenue for new kinds of diagnostics and medicines. And it'll really drive home to kids that humans aren't as separate from nature as we sometimes try to be. Here's one for the students interested in genetics. Some cells are able to directly transfer genes to others in what's known as horizontal transfer. For example, if you were blonde and wanted dark hair, you wouldn't have any option other than dyeing it, or having a child with someone with dark hair if you wanted your offspring to have it yourself. But for these cells, imagine if you as a blonde could just do a special handshake with a dark-haired person, and your hair would turn dark too. It's horizontal because it skips the passing down of genetic information to offspring and allows exchange between members of the same generation. This is a huge problem in antibiotic resistance, but that's definitely going to be another episode. How do cells die? There are a lot of different ways, but the most important one to learn about first is apoptosis, or programmed cell death. First, we would ask students to guess why a cell would want to kill itself, and there are a lot of answers. It's too injured to repair, it has a pathogen that could spread to other cells, or it can't replicate properly. During apoptosis, destructive enzymes known as caspases are activated, destroying all cell machinery. You would give examples of when this happens in the body, and a good one is sunburns. When your skin cells sense too much damage from UV radiation, they know that their DNA and especially their controls on replication are damaged and present a danger to other cells, so they apoptose, causing the marks and painful blisters of a sunburn until new functioning skin cells can form. There are other ways like necrosis, when a cell is unable to maintain itself and slowly decays, or pyroptosis, when a cell kills itself via inflammation, but these are pretty rare compared to apoptosis. Here's something cool to end on if your students are really enjoying the philosophical angle. Imagine a ball rolling down a hill. The ball doesn't decide to move down the hill and expends no energy in doing so because it's following the laws of physics. This is what we call energetically favorable. Cells either do things that are energetically favorable and expend no energy, or spend energy to do things that are energetically unfavorable, which, continuing the ball analogy, would be like powering a machine that rolls the ball back up the hill. Except they're not balls and hills in a cell but chemical reactions, which are similarly favorable or unfavorable. The net result of all these balls rolling up and down hills on scales we can barely see with our strongest microscopes is what we call life. And that's all I have for today. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Help I'm Teaching. I hope I've given you some new ways to look at and explain the building blocks of life. As always, sources and the transcript of this episode will be in the show notes. See you next time.